Hey realtors, congratulations, you're in contract on a house and the appraisal just came back and it's lower than the contract price. Well, what do you do? Well, we're going to cover that in this week's weekly realtors tip right after this. If some of you have been in the industry longer than 10 years, you have experienced this problem. You're in contract, the appraiser goes out to appraise the property, and it comes in too low. That was something we dealt with as agents all the time right after the crash in 09, 10, and 11. But lately, real estate prices are a lot better, and rarely we get and run into situations like this. But if it happens, what do you do? Does the contract dead? How does that work? Do you have to make up the difference? Well, we're going to cover that today. So let's say, for example, the contract price on a house was $100,000. So your buyer wanted to buy a house at the list price of $100,000. Buyer and seller agree. When the appraiser comes out from the bank to appraise the property, they value the property, let's say at $95,000. Well, what do you do from there? Well, we're going to take a look here in the contract. In all real estate contracts, no matter what market you're in, is going to have a boilerplate template talking about this, about what would happen if the appraisal falls through. So let's take a look at the one, the most commonly one that we use, and this is one in Central Ohio, and we're going to dive into that here in a second. All right, so we're going to jump into our Ashmont Realty dashboard and pull up our electronic signature feature, which is all of our agents have access to this. So we're going to go ahead and sign in. Okay, so we're going to pull up our contract that we use. And we're going to, all right. So right here at 13D, if you follow my cursor right here, it says, if the property is appraised for loan purposes, which depending on your market could be 70 to 80% of the time, the buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract by written notice to the seller and the seller's broker, delivered within 3 days of the copy of the appraisal. The notice shall be signed by the buyer and accompanied with the appraisal. The contract shall terminate 3 days after that, and earnest money is given back. And we've talked about earnest money. So now what happens? You're right. Per the agreement, the buyer can say, you know what, I thought the house is worth 100. It's only worth 95, so I'm going to walk away. But hear me out. Who's really losing in that situation? Is it the buyer or the seller? Well, the seller's losing out because the seller was anticipating to getting $100,000 from their property when now they're only going to get 95. So the buyer actually wins in that situation. Buyers very rarely ever walk away. Usually the sellers don't want to sell the house at that price and the deal goes bad. However, there's a couple situations that you can do to remedy and make sure your deal gets done. First and foremost, let's be honest, no one's going to buy a house more than what it's worth. Okay, does that happen? Yes, it does, but there's some extenuating circumstances. Someone just has to have that property. So for example, if the property appraises for 95,000, okay, and they wanted 100 for it, would the buyer technically cough up 5,000 extra dollars out of their own pocket to make up the difference? Yes, they could if they wanted to, all right? But again, no one does that in normal circumstances. So what happens is this. Basically, the new purchase price is what the new appraisal value is. So if the purchase price was 100,000 and only appraises for 95, then unfortunately your seller is going to have to sell that property for $95,000. Now, some situations, sellers obviously are not going to be happy in this whole situation. Well, what do you do? Well, so what do you do? Well, what you need to do is rework the contract and what's considered an addendum. And what that addendum is basically going to look at and look like is going to be basically the new purchase price will be $95,000. All other terms and conditions remain the same. And you want to put an expiration date on it for the seller as well. So the seller has to acknowledge that, listen, this is the new price. This is what we're going to be selling it for. Now, sometimes sellers will say, well, let's use another appraisal, or let's get another appraiser out there, or get another bank or finance company. Two things are going to happen, guys. One, think of it this way. The metaphor I use all the time is, if you go in front of a judge and he convicts you guilty of murder, you go to prison, you basically appeal that conviction, and you end up back in the same courtroom with the same judge telling them that they didn't do their job properly, therefore you should let me off guilty and scot-free. That doesn't go well with appraisers. You're basically saying, appraiser, that you didn't do your job correctly, correct it more in my favor as the seller. It doesn't work. You have a right to, but I've never really seen appraisals overturned unless there's something absolutely egregious. Now, should you take a look at the appraisal to see what type of comps that were used? Absolutely. Now, that doesn't work out in most people's favors. You can obviously go to another finance company, spend another 30 to 45 days on that process to get a new appraisal. But guess what? Appraisers work for different banks as well. So you could be at one bank and get an appraisal, go to another bank to get a separate appraisal, and guess what? You end up with the same appraiser before. So what needs to happen is you need to write an addendum on the buyer to tell the seller, listen, I will pay you for what the house is worth. Okay? If it appraises for 95 instead of 100, I'm sorry, but I'm only willing to pay you for what the house is worth. That's it. Case closed. Take it or leave it. There are some ways that you can sweeten the pot. Maybe the agents can cut their commissions a little bit, or you can not ask for a washer and dryer or some appliances to help out the situation. But bottom line is, for all buyers agents, is don't make your clients pay for a house that's not worth it. That's what really got us into a situation 12, 13 years ago where we were inflating things, overpaying on homes, and a lot of clients got caught. So moral of the story is, if an appraisal comes in low, it doesn't benefit the seller, it benefits the buyer. You got to redo the contract with an addendum. Stay with us in the future for other tips and tricks that we're happy to share to agents all over the United States. And again, this is Adam Ashmont, president of Ashmont Realty. We'll see you next week.